takes decisions. Okay, some interesting developments there, interesting discussions. Have we got any questions from the floor to the panel or individual speakers? Come on, guys. Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Okay, go now.
Okay.
Just I don't know, it might be a bit muddled, but the idea of collaborating with machines, it's a slight challenge, maybe I'll have to read my words, but it feels like humans are collaborating with the non-humans are the same, and just because it's digital, it can't really change anything kind of very basic. And I don't know, just the question of the role of technology. Technology is always often presented itself as a kind of new paradigm, but then it kind of slightly doesn't deliver on the same track.
We can't hear.
So I can't feel that.
So I think, in a sense, technology has, the first sketchpad by Alan Sutherland, we're talking 60 odd years ago, and it's taken an awful long time even today. Working with the Wacom Cintiqs that we use it from time to time, and I still don't get the same sensibility. I don't get the same drag or grip or tacit feel with that. I know that there's lots of developments to try and move that forward, but I think that in a sense these are really important conversations to have. That's why I kind of emphasise the physical in the first sense, so that they have that understanding of that human agency and feel and that sensorial impact as a ways of thinking and learning and being engaged in the world. And I think there's still an awful long way to go with digital to still meet those demands. Even when you put the pencil, the stylus down, for example, sometimes you get a delay, and that can fry my head a little bit actually. It felt really alien the first time I went on and used something like that. So I think there's still a long way to go, but I think it's largely preference. My daughter is 3 years old, and I see her making the most beautiful drawings, and it's immediate the way she engages. But then I'll say, "Oh, what are you doing, darling?" She says, "Oh, I'm watching Paw Patrol, Dad." And I say, "Oh, great, okay. Oh, it's gone off. Okay. Oh, do you want me to help you?" "No, you're okay." So I think for future generations, who knows where we're going to go next, but that kind of understanding that these other generations are having, there's a much greater measure of fluidity and less of a consideration. And I think we need to have more consideration about these, not in a polemic way, but a non-hierarchical way.
I think it's really easy to forget that drawing has always come out of technology, going right back the way back to cave painting. There was a thing I was looking at recently about augmented reality and virtual reality, and someone was talking about immersive experiences within documentary and reportage within VR and AR, and they were calling it an empathy machine. I'd kind of argue that, in fact, there was an article in The Guardian recently about the life room being more empathetic than any of those technologies. Kind of classic life room.
Yeah.
I would also add that everybody seems, or a majority of drawing is about the directness for the artist, but with the digital, the directness is often handed over to the audience. So I'm thinking of certain artists who've been working with code, that the drawing moves according to the way the audience member's head moves. So the sensorial is something that the artist doesn't experience, but it's the digital allows that to get
as an immersive experience.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I'd just add a little bit to that. One of the interesting things I work with students is obviously the area of AI at the moment. And one of the most interesting things that our students are looking at is how information becomes experience. So for instance, if you film 2,000 hours of waves breaking on the shore, and then you film me opening this book, the information reads that this is actually a wave breaking on the shore, because it's built up a whole set of information about how things work that it can only apply to this situation because it's learned a lot of stuff from another situation. And it's those things I find the really interesting aspects of working with new technology.
Okay.
I have a question. I'm not quite sure how to form it, but I think it's about interrogating the material of digital. The way, I suppose you know, talking about the pencil, you could go up to Derwent and go to the pencil museum and find out how they're made, and you're talking about making a pencil, but with a kind of unexpected material as the lead. How easy as students start to embrace digital technology, is it for them to interrogate the material value or the ethical issues around technology? How did it, we talk about coding, where does the code come from these programs they use? How can they interrogate almost that material value, which does have ethical considerations attached to it? I mean, obviously there are loads of ethical questions around artificial intelligence anyway, and robots and all those sorts of things. But I just wonder how, because you're all working in one form or another with these digital technologies, how do you encourage students to interrogate its material value or
Do you mean about disrupting it, in effect, disrupting the technology, in effect?
Could be disrupting it, or do they know where that technology comes from, or actually half of it's been developed for weapons rather than something more creative, or I mean, you know, it's really a heavily loaded area. I mean, you know, there's a complicated story with a pencil, you know, mining, extractive practices, you know, there's nothing straightforward. I just wondered if within this digital conversation some of those things are
that's
coming up
interesting.
for students
What do you think?
or teachers.
This year, a big topic that we're trying to dispel the notion that the digital has no carbon footprint.
It's massive.
Yeah,
It's vast.
So
Yeah.
we're trying to kind of draw that out a little bit more so that people are aware that it's huge and you're not off the grid when you have a phone in your hand.
There's a really good series on Radio 4 by James Bridle called New Ways of Seeing. So he's looking at Berger's ways of seeing, but looking at it through disruptive technology or the technology which is seen as benign, which isn't actually benign. So yeah, yeah. James Bridle, yeah.
I mean, I'm also quite fascinated, and going back to the ethical point, in terms of the Anthropocene as well, because they go hand in hand. And yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
He talks about that, yeah.
Yeah, you know, there's some, yes, there is some highly ethical kind of positions, and I think that, you know, it's good to mention that, because I think within the context of students knowing where this material comes from and looking at the impact that this is having, absolutely should, well, perhaps we should be embedding it additionally into the things that we're talking about within the curriculum, you know, talking about the material responsibilities that we have as well. Perhaps that's something that we should be more acutely aware of and at least build a dialogue with, given where we are today.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Anything else?
It's
on
quite interesting that there's a spectrum. I mean, you know, your blog being used as a resource by people all over the world is the wonderful thing about it all, right? Is this connection, right?
The interesting thing about the blog is it starts with the dialogue with the students. So, I mean, it's interesting that point about ethics, that one of the blogs is actually, where does graphite come from? And we ended up talking about graphite mines in China and the state of farming in that area, and how that, you know, those things spin off because students are very keen to understand how these issues are impacting on the decisions they're making in terms of making work. So they're often the people that are keeping me on track rather than me trying to deliver something as part of the program. To sort of it's like, come on, you're part of the problem. You know. So I have to engage with that.
That's interesting. Yep. Yeah.
With digital drawing, it's not something that I've investigated in big ways. This is a genuine question to you. How do you feel that digital drawing, as compared to drawing, say, with a conventional drawing tool, relates to language and thinking? Because I can theorise about this, and I understand this rupture you get with digital, which actually briefly describe, which
Okay.
stops your thinking, which stops your flow, which stops you applying maybe a linguistically informed narrative to your work as you're doing it, or in gaining insight, feedback from your drawing, that reflexive relationship you have with your work.
I'm just going to relay the question to the back.
Sorry.
Which is, what's if there's a relationship between we can probably all take for granted the relationship with, old style drawing and writing. What is the relationship with a digital drawing and writing? Over to you.
Well, I'll quote my mentor, Peter Prendergast,
Yeah.
who was taught by Albach, and I don't know whether this quote comes in. He said, "Stefan, drawing is 90% looking, 10% doing." Okay, so that kind of that ambiguity is there. When I'm looking through a camera, that interdependency of looking, I feel that channel. The relationship to crowds, who I mentioned, in terms of aggregate apparatus, that's something that I'm beginning to become more aware of. I think that yes, digital is different to conventional, and we know this. So it's far more of a conceptual approach in a sense, yeah. But I think in terms of fluidity, when I'm working on a keyboard, say for example I'm editing, because I work with shortcuts, it's tacit, it's still tacit, but I can actually look directly at the screen. I'm still working with an interface. There's a different depth of field, of course there is, but that tacit engagement through shortcuts, you build a measure of fluency through that, so that perhaps reduces the gap slightly in terms of that flow, if you like, and the differentiation between material and digital. But it depends on what you're working with. It depends on the devices, I guess. So I hope, in part, that sort of answers it.
I mean, that might change anyway with the way technology changes. If you think of the keyboard and the mouse, that's been with us for a long time.
Yeah.
That's going to change to gesture, maybe. Don't know.
We have good tilt brush and things like that as well. So, but I've never got around to using it just yet, so I couldn't really give a perspective on that.
Because it's that continual sort of clicking one button that does a certain thing and then another
That's
button
old technology,
which goes
really.
over
That's going to change, I think.
Yeah,
It
it's changing.
just kind of interrupts my
Yeah,
thinking
yeah,
completely.
yeah.
I cannot, well, not
Yeah.
completely, but it's a totally different
Yeah.
experience for me.
Like I said, I think
It's
we're at an
not like-
onset right now of a shift. I think it's about to happen, really, or it is happening.
Yeah. Yeah, you go.
Just wondering really if you've thought about taking the digital, or if you are taking the digital one step further, so that you're not just looking at the digital for the drawing, but for the actual production of the drawing afterwards, the possibilities of the new digital age giving you tactile drawings, the possibility of embossing drawings, and even producing drawings in 3D through the 3D printing and so on, so that drawing becomes not just a 2D image that you can see, but also a 2D or 3D image that you can feel.
Can I, yeah? I'm actually, I've just finished working with on a 5-year residency with the School of Archaeology at Oxford University, and we've been, as the piece that was in the Lumen Prize was a result of that 5-year engagement with TAS inquiry. Again, that notion of transcoding and changing, going through the multi-different approaches that you can work with, whether it's 3D printing is something that we're working towards for the next new residency that I'm just starting on at Blenheim Palace. Digital tapestry as well as a way forward through it. So the format of these files offers you transferability to go and extend it to other digital things, but also to bring it back into some kind of physical form, which I think is a very important thing personally.
No, just I've done quite a lot of work with students with swell paper. And if
I've
you,
heard of
yeah, you must.
yes, I haven't
Basically,
experienced
it's like you put the paper through a photocopier, but the heat expands the line, so you can then feel it as a drawing. And what's been very interesting there is actually getting people to look at the difference between the way you design for sight and for not sight, and the amount of complex information. It gets students really aware of how to separate forms out as opposed to overlap them. We often work with how to take a complex thing that's seen visually, but then to actually simplify it by touch. but swell paper is what we use to get to understand that.
That's
I'm
interesting.
also thinking of sonic wire sculpture, which is a software that you plot points on a kind of 3D rendering of an object, and the object moves and plays. It produces sound almost like a pianola scroll would have, but it's a three-dimensional object that turns and produces the sound. It's worth looking up.
Okay, maybe two more questions. You and then Mike.
I wanted to try and answer this question because I'm an artist who drawing is what I do, but I use a lot of different media to draw, and some of the things I use are digital media. So I was kind of thinking about answering this kind of question because for me, it's not really about the precise thing that the media does. It's about how I can play around with the media. So, for example, when I'm using a camera to draw, I'm not taking a photograph of something I think is drawing. What I'm doing is I'm literally drawing with the camera. And this can involve, this is particularly interesting with a digital camera because it works very differently from the old-fashioned camera. And what I do is I play with all the elements of the camera, like the focus, the zoom, using gesture, and zooming in on things, and changing what I do with the camera, but it's very, very intuitive. So I'm drawing with the medium, and because of that, it doesn't really matter what the characteristics of the medium are. I can take any medium and mess around with it. And it's the same with, I do use digital imagery, but I don't use it in the way I think that a lot of people use it for another purpose. I'm actually interested in doing something with what happens when I do it. So I don't mind the fact that you're talking about the difference between the pencil and the way you feel on the paper, which is a very different feeling. But the fact that you've got another pencil that does something completely different to me, well, yeah, I want to explore that as well. So for me, it's about exploring what a medium will do and what I personally can do with it and how far I can push that. And some of the imagery I get, I mean, I wouldn't even have ever been able to describe it or anticipate it because it happens through just an intuitive experience over time and things happen and then it's that wonderful mistake, but it's not, it's a work of art, you know. And I think that's true of any medium you work with, having worked in 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions, drawing on paper, I work with wire, I work with whatever comes along really. But it's the same kind of the exploration of what the medium you're working with is, rather than thinking, well, this has got a function, this is
No,
you know, what you're meant to
that's a good
do with
point.
this. I never think about that at all. My son's a coder actually, and he sometimes shows me how to do something. And then I get in and do something, he says, well, what are you doing with it? How did you do that? You know, it's amazing how you do it. I have no idea how I did it, I just did it because I was exploring the media.
But even with codification, it's a measure of authorship because it's been written by a human.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
You know,
yeah.
so
yeah,
that's
Okay.
yeah.
good to say.
Mike.
I was interested to just, maybe don't need to kind of try and address this now, but just conscious of time as well, but still, I don't want to ask a long question, but I'm just interested in the fact that you guys are all contributing in different ways to fine art contexts, and we've got colleagues in the room who are also been having conversations with who are teaching drawing in different disciplines, quite different. I'm interested in this kind of way in which, in different ways, you're working with students, either to support students in their practice and expectations around drawing, maybe their development, to work with them in a really quite, varied sort of way and responsive way, I guess, to their own individual interests. And maybe, Kelly, for me, with your talk, also kind of wanted to blast some of their expectations around drawing practice kind of into a new kind of zone, really, of possibilities, worldly possibilities. I'm interested in this. There's something that Chloe that's been talked about this morning, I think, that's sort of been back on my mind, which is this idea that maybe if students can be encouraged in having the possibility of different approaches within their kind of toolbox, if you like, or their orbit of practice, different possibilities, even different techniques in drawing, so they can approach any subject or inquiry in different ways, and that they can somehow then learn through these different types of approaches through comparing, evaluating, analysing, and so on. That's a particular. I suppose what I'm trying to drive towards is this question of teaching perhaps in a slightly more linear or structured way versus trying to encourage this eclecticism or this more diverse set of actual practices. And what I teach fine art as well, and I feel like in a fine art studio course, often that breadth of experience and of learning is often done through peer-to-peer, listening in on other people's tutorials, being in a crypt with such a varied range of students that actually you pick up that varied awareness through the group. But whether or not it's appropriate to try to actually, in different disciplines, teach a variety of approaches to, say, drawing techniques, if that's going to increase our learning, or, you see what I mean? I'm just trying to think about this variety of...
I can see what you mean. I'd bring it slightly different way around, a variety of approaches to problem solving.
Right.
Because I think the more different disciplines you're aware of, you can see how their problem solving structure is slightly different.
Yeah.
So again, going back to the blog, I will look at different disciplines and then say, look, they solve problems through drawing like this. So how are you going to do it? I mean, like the police crime scene investigations. They actually do a whole series of drawings of crime scenes which are laid out in a very particular way in order for information to be given. Slightly different to, say, archaeological digs and the way they are laid out and the way they're linked to satellite systems, which is quite different again to electrical engineers and the way they have to do drawings, looking at the way the fastest or the most connections you can get in a complicated circuit, for instance. So each discipline does use drawing in a slightly different way to solve a problem. The interesting thing, I think, for fine art students is the fact they often are limited in their approaches to the problem solving. So by saying, look, here's 5 or 6 very different ways, so what's your job now? Do you take one of those and follow it, the implications of it, or do you have to come up with way 7 as a way of solving this problem?
There's another thing, it kind of comes back to Andrew's presentation this morning about this, what the life room did or the shared activity did, which is everyone having the same purpose and being able to watch the marks, not just the ones you're putting down on the page, but what everybody else is doing in that same shared purpose and develop. And that's not necessarily, the benefits to doing that is, I don't think that's restricted to fine art. Just to be able to see that there's no fixed answer to anything and that everyone's kind of struggling together in the same activity.
We're going to have to wrap that up. That's great. Thanks a lot. Well done. Well done.
Thank you very much.